And thank you, everyone, for this invitation to present to you this morning and share some of my ongoing work. I will be speaking in English, and most of what I say will be on the screen, but I think there's facility for some additional translation if that is needed. What do you see? When I first saw this picture at an art exhibition in London, I didn't know what I was seeing. Most of the other images around the room showed scenes of violence from El Salvador, which was what my doctoral research was on, and I had gone to the exhibition for that reason. This was one of the most striking images, but it was the only one I didn't see what I was seeing. The curator of the exhibition, seeing that I was so interested in it, came over to me and said, "Yes, that's a picture of, well, you can see," which of course was my problem. I couldn't see. It was only when she noticed my ongoing bewilderment that she drew my attention to the fact that this is the face of a figure in extreme pain. We can pick out, perhaps, the mouth, perhaps a tooth, a nose, and the socket of the eye. Perhaps one of El Salvador's torture victims. The wider context of this presentation paper is my ongoing work on crucifixion and what I call the scandal of the cross, to use a biblical image. This research draws on contemporary accounts of sexualized violence and torture in conflicts as a lens for rereading the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth as a theologian. I've been doing this work since first publishing an article, Crucifixion, State Terror and Sexual Abuse, in Union Seminary Quarterly Review in 1999. And any of you who are already wired in and on the internet can check that article out. A quick caveat before I get started. Some of the images presented in what follows explore news media representation and misrepresentation of sexualized violence. In a separate research project, I'm working with a colleague at Trinity on the ethics of research into sexualized violence, which I hope will better inform this type of work in future. In the meantime, though, I believe it's appropriate to share these images in this setting this morning, but I am also aware that they raise ethical issues. And a clarification. There can be little doubt that sexualized violence in conflicts is most frequently directed by men against women. The primary focus in what follows is sexualized violence by men against other men, which often receives even less attention than sexualized violence against women and girls. However, this focus on male victims and survivors is not intended to suggest that such violence is more important or more horrific than sexualized violence against women and girls. To come back, what do we see? And the image that you have perhaps been looking at from Goya's Disasters of War, entitled Tampoco, or This, or Nor This, done from the Spanish Peninsular War, 1810 to 1820, and noted just up here you might see number 36 in a sequence that Goya did. We're invited, I think, particularly to look at this image because it's one of the images which features somebody looking within the image itself, this figure here. For many in the English-speaking world, it's a very familiar image because it was used for Susan Sontag's very influential and very insightful work regarding the pain of others, published by Penguin in 2003. Viewed in isolation, though, it's easy to miss the fact that in Goya's image 36, the hanged man's trousers are pulled down to his knees, suggesting sexualized humiliation, at least, and perhaps violence. However, when viewed in its place in Goya's original sequence, amidst the explicit sexualized images of 33, 37, and 39, it might be more likely to be noticed. On its own as image 36, I don't think I've ever met anyone who said, yes, I noticed that on Susan Sontag's book. It's not even clear to me that Sontag herself, given how she discusses the image in the book itself, is aware of the image having sexualized violence and has consciously chosen, for whatever reason, not to discuss that element of it, or whether she herself is not aware of it. That's a question I still have. One of the organisations which I think has done most work to draw our attention to the abuses of sexualised violence in conflicts is the Women's Media Centre, started by the initiative of Gloria Steinem to figure out what we've missed along the way when it comes to rape in war. From the Holocaust onward, we've documented, this is Steinem talking, sexual abuses committed from Bangladesh to Egypt. The idea is to figure out how stigma, shame and death has prevented us from knowing fully what occurred in these wars. They have a very useful website, this one featuring, you can see the text there, the abuses against more than 100,000 women who were raped in the 36 years of the Guatemalan genocide, in which at least 200,000 people died. And it was actually human rights reports on gender-based violence in Central America that first drew me as a theologian into this work, having an interest, as I did then, in Latin American liberation theology, and asking why these sorts of abuses were not more prominent in theological accounts of the violence. Steinem says for her, particularly influential works were this one in 2010, Hedgepeth and Saidel, their work on sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust, an almost taboo area to explore that chapter of history previously. The other book she cites too as being particularly influential in prompting her to set up her project, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power, a book by Danielle Maguire, which explores an area of African American history that is almost completely neglected in terms of people understanding the history of the civil rights movement. And then one more that I personally, being British, have found very influential, Caroline Elkin's work, Imperial Reckoning, The Untold Story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya, or in the UK edition, just Britain's Gulag, talking about British colonial response to the so-called Mau Mau uprising and the sexualised abuses which were part of the counterinsurgency strategy. Back to Goya, and let's reframe and reset that image you will call number 36. Here it is in the sequence with number 33, number 37 and 39. Set in this sequence, it's probably unavoidable to notice the sexualised violence, or it's certainly much more prominent, not least the title of image 36, or this, deliberately invites us to situate the image with reference to the other images around it. All this, I think, gets lost if you just view the image on its own. So, some questions. When presented with reports and images of violence in the news media, to what extent are these likely to frame the pain of others, which is, I think, what image 36 does for most people? It's an image of pain, the hanged man, but less likely to frame the shame of others, to leave out of the picture something which is as important to understand why that particular violence happened. two case studies that I'm working on, one that I'm going to speak on this morning, the Tyler Hicks photos of an Afghanistan execution from 2001, and then the other one I've done more work on but won't speak about today, the Death of Gaddafi video revealing the sexualised violence when he was captured and immediately before his execution. My questions. How and why does this framing, deframing and reframing happen? And what is the relevance of all this to theology and the most central image of execution in theology, the image of the cross? So the Tyler Hicks photos, the execution by the Northern Alliance. Here the US-based photojournalist Tyler Hicks. A short report in the New York Times by David Rode on the discovery and execution of a wounded Taliban fighter, 13th November 2001, was accompanied by a series of 3 pictures by photographer Tyler Hicks. These photos received particular attention when a journalist asked George W. Bush about them in a White House press briefing. Here's David Rhodes' report. The headline, A Nation Challenged, the Front Lines, Executions and Looting as Alliance Nears Kabul. Dated November 12th. Near an abandoned Taliban bunker, Northern Alliance soldiers dragged a wounded Taliban soldier out of a ditch today. As the terrified man begged for his life, the Alliance soldiers pulled him to his feet. They searched him and emptied his pockets. Then one soldier fired 2 bursts from his rifle into the man's chest. A second soldier beat the lifeless body with his rifle butt. A third repeatedly smashed a rocket-propelled grenade launcher into the man's head. Accompanying that story on the front page of the New York Times, Tyler Hicks photos, or at least 3 of them. Susan Sontag, in Regarding the Pain of Others, says, who can forget the 3-colour pictures by Tyler Hicks that the New York Times ran across the upper half of the first page of its daily section devoted to America's new war? The triptych depicted the fate of a wounded Taliban soldier in uniform who had been found in a ditch by Northern Alliance soldiers advancing towards Kabul. The first panel, being dragged on his back by 2 of his captors. This is Sontag's description. One has grabbed an arm, the other a leg, along a rocky road. The second panel, and she says, the camera is very near, surrounded, gazing up in terror as he is being pulled to his feet. The third panel, at the moment of death, supine with arms outstretched and knees bent, naked and bloodied from the waist down, being finished off by the military mob that has gathered to butcher him. Sontag continues, an ample reservoir of stoicism is needed to get through the great newspaper of record each morning, the New York Times, given the likelihood of seeing photographs that could make you cry, and the pity and disgust that pictures like Hicks's inspire should not distract you from asking, what pictures, whose cruelties, whose deaths are not being shown? Both Rhodes' article and Sontag's book are restrained in their comments on the final photo by Hicks. The probability of sexualised violence is not considered in either case. Rode mentions that he was brutalised after being shot, but makes no mention of sexualised violence. Sontag notes his appearance and posture as, quote, supine with arms outstretched and knees bent, naked and bloodied from the waist down, but does not draw any conclusions from this. The Tyler Execution series subsequently won first place in the 2002 Pictures of the Year International (POYI) competition. POYI is sponsored by the Missouri School of Journalism, and it shows the photo of the final photo of the execution, number 3 in the New York Times series, as actually number 7 in a sequence by Hicks. So we get a little bit more on the sequence of the photos, which seems to offer us a fuller understanding. Here, photo 1. Northern Alliance soldiers alert others as they discover a wounded Taliban soldier during their advance from the Bagram front line toward Kabul. The text I'm reading is from the POYI website. The attack was launched from several front lines and continued until dark, with the Northern Alliance facing little resistance from fleeing Taliban. So this picture not shown in the New York Times report. Photo 2. A Taliban soldier who had been laying motionless in a ditch in an attempt to hide himself from the advancing Northern Alliance is dragged to his feet as another Taliban soldier, killed moments earlier, lays dead on the road. The Northern Alliance was making a quick advance towards Kabul from this pivotal front line, suffering few casualties. An injured Taliban soldier pleads for his life after being captured by Northern Alliance soldiers during their advance towards Kabul, Afghanistan. A small number of hardline Taliban soldiers continued to try to fight back the Northern Alliance, but were overwhelmed by the speed of the advance. An injured Taliban soldier who had been laying motionless in a ditch in attempt to hide himself is forced to walk by advancing Northern Alliance soldiers after they discovered him during their push towards Kabul. He had been shot in the leg shortly before while resisting the Northern Alliance. An injured Taliban soldier is dragged by the Northern Alliance soldiers shortly after his discovery in a ditch alongside the road. The Taliban soldier had been shot in the leg while trying to resist the Northern Alliance advance towards Kabul. His pants were dragged to his feet as he was pulled along the road. This one also not shown by the New York Times. An injured Taliban soldier who had been laying motionless in a ditch in an attempt to hide himself begs for his life as he is captured and intimidated by Northern Alliance soldiers during their advance towards Kabul. His pants were pulled down as a result of him being dragged along the road. And finally, 3 Northern Alliance soldiers fire simultaneously into a Taliban soldier who had been captured while attempting to resist their advance towards Kabul. A small number of hardline Taliban soldiers chose to stay and fight on this front line, a pivotal stronghold protecting the road to Kabul, but those who didn't escape were killed immediately. His pants, bloodied from an earlier shot, were pulled down as a result of him being dragged along the road. The man yelling in the background was encouraging the soldiers in their actions. Now, what is striking and perhaps difficult to put together where just seen in sequence one and after another like that is that we do have here 2 different sequences. A New York Times and Susan Sontag sequence on the left, and the POYI sequence on the right. The POYI sequence has more pictures, but in terms of the 3 that we have that it shares with the New York Times, we do have a different sequence as to what has happened. Some preliminary observations, the first of which is simply that there is a difference here. The second, that the POY sequence seems to be the one that has changed the logical order of the photos. Would photo 5 in its sequence not be more likely to follow photo 2? If it did, then that would bring the POYI sequence into line with the New York Times Sontag sequence. It seems, at least in my reading of it, that the change of sequence is to explain how the man's pants came loose whilst he was being dragged, a motif which is repeated in the text accompanying a number of the photos, as you will no doubt have noticed. The POYI text emphasises that the man's pants came down whilst he is being dragged along the ground. But does this explain how he looks in the final photo? So I would suggest that actually the sequence is something like this. POYI photo 2, you can see the man being dragged out of the ditch. You can see one of the Northern Alliance soldiers has his ankle, another has his hand. This draws attention to the fact that his pants were dragged down to his feet as he was pulled along the road, but that unfortunately is the wrong photo accompanying the text. POY photo 3 is him being pulled to his feet, and that's correct. And my question is, why is this done? Let me just go back, though, since the wrong photo is inserted there, to what should have been the right photo, and that's this photo here. You can see him being dragged along in much the same way as he was dragged out of the ditch. One soldier has his ankle and another has his arm. You can see at the end of the dragging process, his trousers are still in place. Unlike the motif that we've constantly been told about in the accompanying text, it is not the case, if the photos are ordered in the correct order, that it is the dragging along the ground which has pulled his pants down. It must be some other explanation. As Jolyon Mitchell notes in his book Media Violence and Christian Ethics, published by Cambridge University Press, there is a constant process within the media of deciding what to reveal and what to conceal. These issues are especially sensitive for images of sexualised violence. The New York Times account and Sontag's commentary on it pass over the implication of sexualised violence in silence, and most readers are probably unaware of it, I suspect. However, the POYI series actively conceals sexualised violence rather than reveals it. Perhaps this is because it is perceived as shameful for the victim, or too disturbing for the viewer, or too incriminating for the perpetrators. It might also raise questions about the ethical roles of the photographer and others present, the bystanders. There are times, I think, when it is right to conceal rather than reveal sexualised violence, though it is much more questionable whether it is right to change a sequence to give an intentionally misleading impression in the way that the POYI exhibition did. But what does all this have to do with theology, and particularly public theology, a theology which seeks to relate theological insights to public issues? My propositions would be that Christian art and Christian theology tend to frame the cross in sanitised terms, to avoid the shame associated with sexualised violence. Sometimes it is passed over in silence, sometimes it is actively concealed. So we have both the dynamics that we saw in the images of execution from Afghanistan, one approach just to pass over in silence and not draw attention to the sexualised violence, and another approach which is to actively conceal it, make it appear to be something other than it is. What I suggest is that to better understand crucifixion and the scandal of the cross, there is a need to reframe them in terms of sexualised violence, which is intended as an extreme public shaming. A theology which reframes the crucifixion in this way will also have something distinctive important to say about contemporary torture and sexualised violence as public issues. So it's not just a matter of being truthful to the past and to history, though I think that is very significant, but it is also about theology asking itself difficult questions so it can make a significant contribution to some very important debates which are going on at present. Let's explore this in a little bit of detail. What are our images of the cross? I was at a conference in Assisi in Italy last year, and the San Damiano cross is very prominent there. It's a beautiful image, but it's an image not so much of a crucified figure as a risen figure. It gives us a very peaceful image of the cross. Historically, the experience of execution on a cross would have been nothing like this. Much more like, perhaps, the Essene crucifix, one of the oldest images, and one which picks up on the pain and brutality and suffering of the cross. But quite rare to see images of the cross which pick up on the shame of the cross, the naked figure on the cross. This one, Eric Gills' Crucifixion from 1910. But I think Gill has something to share in terms of what crucifixion was actually like. Looking at the historical evidence, the Romans did not have much to say about crucifixion in terms of sharing what actually happened. It was almost unspeakable in Roman society to go into the details of what crucifixion actually involved. But we do get some glimpses, and I think they point in a direction which is much closer to Gill's version of the cross than the San Damiano version. For example, the Jewish historian Josephus, talking about the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, writes, "The soldiers themselves, through rage and bitterness, nailed up their victims in various attitudes as a grim joke, till owing to the vast numbers there was no room for the crosses and no crosses for the bodies." It is cryptic as to what this grim joke of crucifixion might have been, but it's left as a cryptic clue, I think. Seneca, writing in about 40 CE, says, "I see crosses there," he's talking about Bithynia, "not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with head down to the ground. Some impale their private parts. Others stretch out their arms on the gibbet or on the cross." What's interesting here, I think, is if you look at Christian art, the part of this passage which we see very, very commonly is the notion of a cross in which the arms are stretched out on the crossbeam. But how many images of crucifixion do we ever see which take account of the middle phrase there? Some impale their private parts. Seneca, again, in a dialogue in which he is parodying and dismissing what he sees as the shameful attitude of anyone who says that life is so important that as long as you have life, as long as you can breathe, whatever your circumstance, you are in a better situation than if you were dead. And to dismiss that idea, he says, well, what if you are in a situation which is so painful and so shameful that nobody in his right mind would wish to live in that situation rather than to welcome the release of death. So the first part of the quote, the indented part, he puts in the mouth of an opponent only to knock it down in his own words, which are to follow. So his opponent suggests, "Fashion me with a palsied hand, weak of foot and a cripple. Build upon me a crook-backed hump. Shake my teeth till they rattle. All is well if my life remains. Save, oh save it, I pray you, though I sit on the piercing cross." And Seneca's response to that, his response to somebody who said, well, as long as I live, that's the important thing. Even the cross would be bearable for as long as I live. Seneca says, "Is it worthwhile to weigh down upon one's own wound and hang impaled upon a gibbet, that one may but postpone something which is the balm of troubles, the end of punishment? Is it worth all this to possess the breath of life, only to give it up? So we have here a difference of opinion, Seneca's very clear opinion that death is a welcome release from the cross, but also the strong hint that crucifixions could involve impalement. His words, to weigh down upon one's own wound is suggestive of the impalement and shame of crucifixion. So this image of the cross, which is often attributed to Michelangelo, does, I think, give a provocative but more honest impression of the naked victim on the cross and the shame and humiliation that goes with the naked display of a prisoner in public. But if what Seneca is saying is right, and if that is common in crucifixions, then I think we also need to consider images like this from Robert Knox's book of 1681 on an execution in Ceylon, not framed as a crucifixion, but clearly with resonance of a crucifixion, and the possibility for the framework of the cross to be used as an instrument of impalement and sexualized violence. Why pursue this research, though? Why open up these questions? Without understanding the unspeakable scandal of crucifixion, without understanding why it is in Scripture crucifixion is referred to as a scandal and what that really involves, there is little sense to my mind of the countercultural power of the resurrection message. We do not understand the message of being raised after crucifixion if we don't understand why it was that crucifixion was intended to so utterly destroy both the physical person and any dignified memory that people might seek to have of him or her. The worth and human dignity of victims is to be affirmed even in the face of unspeakable violence. God does not turn away from the victims of unspeakable violence, past or present, even if victims of that violence feel so shamed that they cannot understand God's ongoing presence with them. Tearfund UK, a Christian relief and development agency, has recently published an extraordinary report on sexualised violence during conflict as a challenge for the worldwide churches. Entitled Silent No More, The Untapped Potential of the Church in Addressing Sexualised Violence, published in 2011, it's based on extensive research by Elizabeth LaRue at Stellenbosch University. Her research focuses on sexualised violence in African conflicts. And that's a copy of the report. It's freely available as PDF. Its findings, I think, are very significant. The report suggests that victims of sexualised violence in Africa see the churches as the institutions best placed to help them, but in practice receive little help from the churches. A very interesting contrast between the expressed opinion of victims who see the churches as the institution they most feel is able to help them, and yet their actual experience is very little help comes from the churches. Furthermore, it suggests that the problem is not that the churches are unaware of what has happened to many victims. The churches are aware of sexualised violence in conflict, but they are reluctant to address it because they do not see it as a theological matter. They do not see it as part of their concern as church. Let me return to Gloria Steinem for, I think, a useful quote as to why this work is worth doing. For me, she says, inspiration comes from seeing positive results. For instance, a woman survivor of a brutal rape in the Congo is rejected by her family, but learns she's not alone or at fault from the story of a Jewish woman who has survived rape and the Holocaust, only to be shunned as if she had collaborated. Each example illuminates another. We have to know what's wrong to change what's wrong, but the special problem of sexualised violence is used to silence and shame the victim, making it more difficult for victims to know what has happened to others, and also making it more likely that they carry an added burden of internalised blame and shame around with them, no matter that that is undeserved. So in conclusion, in this context, the context of sexualised violence in conflict, there is scope, I think, for theology to engage with the churches and wider society to address sexualised violence in conflict as a pressing issue of our day in so many different conflict situations. Furthermore, if theologians, biblical scholars and Christian ethicists are willing to critically interrogate their own Christian tradition and the centrality within it of the cross and what this really involved, then they will have much to contribute to this wider public debate. Instead of being seen as largely irrelevant to the contemporary issue, they will be seen to have something distinctive and very important to say. Thank you.